The air hung thick and heavy over the Mississippi Delta in 1850, a humid, suffocating blanket woven from Spanish moss and the endless, aching smell of stagnant water. It was a place where sound died, where the sun filtered through the cypress canopy in sickly green-tinged shafts, and where life was cheaper than the cottonseed spat onto the black earth. But even in this landscape accustomed to sudden, casual violence, what happened in the deep, waterlogged heart of Thorn's Folly Plantation was whispered about, not in fear of the gallows or the whip, but in raw, animal terror that transcended the normal cruelties of the age. The story was not about a small, localized revolt or the tragic flight of a few desperate souls seeking freedom. This was a narrative of annihilation, a tale so stark and unbelievable that those who first recounted it were often met with swift, disbelieving scorn, followed by a cold, penetrating dread once the facts could no longer be denied. 28 men, 28 professional, heavily armed and seasoned slave catchers, men who made their living tracking, capturing, and brutally disciplining the enslaved, disappeared into the Delta wilderness seeking a single fugitive. They went in confident, arrogant, and supremely assured of their superiority. They returned, or rather they did not return, leaving behind a scene of carnage so absolute, so methodical, that it challenged the very definition of humanity and exposed the deep, festering fear that lay beneath the veneer of Southern gentility. This was the legend of the Delta Man, a name whispered only after dark, long after the institution that birthed him had crumbled into dust. To understand the immensity of the resulting violence, one must first understand the man and the environment that forged him. He was known only as Cain on the vast, miserable stretch of Thorn's Folly, a sprawling, merciless plantation carved out of the swamp by sheer force and human agony. Cain was a man of unusual stature, his frame hardened not by the soft labor of the house, but by the relentless, back-breaking toil of clearing new land, pulling stumps, wrestling with the recalcitrant soil, and fighting the very marsh itself. He possessed a silent, watchful disposition that plantation owners often mistook for dullness or obedience, but which was, in reality, a deep well of suppressed, corrosive fury. The year 1850 marked a zenith of prosperity and paranoia in the Deep South. The cotton gin had made certain men incredibly wealthy, but the wealth rested upon a volatile foundation of enforced servitude. Elias Thorn, the owner of Thorn's Folly, was a man whose cruelty was systemic rather than merely temperamental. He saw his laborers not as people, but as expensive, renewable tools. His control was absolute, and his laws were enforced by a hierarchy of vicious overseers, none more feared than a man named Silas, whose specialization was the punitive use of the rawhide whip. The spark that ignited the explosion was not premeditated. It was the inevitable rupture resulting from years of compression. It happened one stifling August afternoon. The sun was an oppressive weight in the sky, threatening to melt the very marrow from one's bones. A momentary lapse in work by a young boy, perhaps Cain's younger relative, led Silas the overseer to deliver a punishment that went beyond corrective pain into sadistic glee. Cain, who had endured every manner of degradation and brutality, watched this specific act. The prolonged, mocking screams of the child shatter something fundamental within him. The chains of obedience, forged over a lifetime of terror, snapped not with a clang, but with a silent, terrifying finality. The confrontation was swift and total. Cain did not argue, beg, or flee. He simply stopped his work, straightened his massive frame, and moved towards Silas. The overseer, accustomed to the immediate paralyzed submission of his victims, laughed, raising the whip again. That laugh was the last sound Silas ever made. Cain's actions in that moment were described later only in hushed, incomplete fragments, mostly concerning the unnatural speed and terrifying power of his hands. He did not use a tool. He used his own raw strength. Silas was disarmed, subdued, and silenced in a matter of seconds, his body broken and left in the row where he had just exerted his petty tyranny. But Cain did not stop there. The killing of an overseer, though a profound act of rebellion, would normally result in immediate flight into the swamps, hoping for a quick death rather than the slow torture of recapture. Cain, however, walked calmly to the slave quarters, gathered nothing but a small, heavy axe head he had secretly sharpened, and then, in a terrifying display of controlled rage, confronted the remaining terrified field overseers and several trusted house servants who acted as informants. The ensuing minutes involved a further 3 deaths. These were not messy, panicked murders. They were executions delivered with a chilling precision that suggested not just desperation, but a calculated resolve to burn the bridges behind him. He took their firearms, a heavy single-shot rifle and a few pistols, and vanished into the dense, suffocating woods that marked the border of the property, melting into the shadows and the mud. This was no ordinary runaway. An isolated murder was tragic, but 4 highly placed personnel, including the primary overseer, were an intolerable affront to Elias Thorne's absolute authority and financial standing. The potential for the news to spread, for this single act of defiance to metastasize into widespread revolt, terrified him more than the loss of his property. The fugitive had not just killed men, he had attacked the very idea of the plantation system. The response was immediate, overwhelming, and funded by a reservoir of panicked wealth. Elias Thorne dispatched riders the instant the bodies were discovered, summoning not merely local planters and their dogs, but the elite of the professional manhunters from Natchez and Vumpkin County. These were not simple bounty hunters. They were professional trackers, experts in reading the subtle signs of the bayou, masters of the rifle, and specialists in what they referred to chillingly as Negro persuasion. Thorne demanded swift, exemplary justice. He wanted Cain captured, but more importantly, he wanted him broken publicly, preferably alive, as a lesson. The man who led the expedition was Captain Jebediah Colt, a celebrated tracker whose reputation had been earned through years of merciless efficiency. Colt was a man of cold, reptilian focus, often boasting that no fugitive, no matter how clever or strong, could evade his scent hounds or his tactics in the dense wetlands. Colt assembled his party with clinical precision. In total, counting Colt himself, there were 28 men, a perfect fighting force for the environment. Heavily armed, mounted where possible, and flanked by a pack of the most vicious bloodhounds available, trained to ignore decoys and follow the human scent until collapse. The Delta Man will be found before the sun sets tomorrow, Colt assured Thorne, standing proudly amidst his assembled force, the sun glinting off their brass buttons and polished rifles. He might be strong, but he is a field hand. We are 28 professionals. The swamp may hide a rabbit, but it cannot hide a monster. The confidence of the party was palpable. They carried with them the certainty of their station and the assurance that their quarry was merely property that had briefly malfunctioned. They were equipped with everything necessary for a prolonged search: salted pork, hardtack, whiskey, spare powder and shot, and chains. Lots of chains. But as they moved deeper into the oppressive delta terrain, the confidence began to thin, replaced by an unsettling awareness of the environment's true nature. The Mississippi Delta, particularly the unmarked lands bordering Thorne's Folly, was a maze of bayous and sloughs, a primordial landscape of mud, tangled roots and water moccasins. It swallowed sound and light, distorting distance and time. The first few hours of the hunt were standard. The dogs picked up the scent trail immediately, leading the party away from the cultivated fields and into the dense cypress groves, where the water stood fetid and still. Colt led his men with ruthless efficiency, pushing them through patches of sawgrass that shredded their expensive leather, demanding silence and speed. Yet, something was subtly wrong. Cain's trail was too clear. Runaways, desperate and panicked, usually attempted to mask their tracks, wading upstream in a river, doubling back, or using thick briar patches to obscure their passage. Cain had done none of this. His tracks were deep and steady, indicating a man moving purposefully, not fleeing in terror. It was almost as if he wanted them to follow. The men started muttering. This was unusual. It suggested either a fatal stupidity in the fugitive or a dangerous cold calculation. Midday found the hunters deep in the maze of watery land, where the air was so still that sweat refused to evaporate. The dogs, which had started the day baying furiously, now moved with hesitation, their noses close to the ground, occasionally whining softly as if confused or alarmed. Captain Colt, riding slightly ahead on his sturdy mare, signaled a halt. He dismounted, his boots sinking immediately into the soft black earth. "What is it, Captain?" asked Mr. Jasper, the second in command, a man notorious for his cold temper and the enjoyment he took in his work. "Silence," Colt hissed, gesturing to the absolute stillness of the swamp. Normally, the delta was loud, choked with the buzz of insects, the splash of fish, the croak of frogs. Now there was nothing. The sound of the 28 men, the horses and the dogs seemed an intrusion, deafening in the unnatural quiet. "He is near," Jasper stated, pulling his heavy hunting knife. "Too near and too silent," Colt countered, his eyes scanning the dense hanging curtain of moss. "The dogs are confused. The scent trail ends abruptly right here." He pointed to a shallow, muddy pool surrounded by ancient cypress knees. The water was undisturbed. Colt knelt, inspecting the ground, his practiced eye noticing something profoundly disturbing. The deep tracks of the fugitive ended right at the water's edge, as if he had simply dissolved into the marsh. But closer inspection revealed subtle disturbances, not of a man wading or swimming away, but of heavy, deliberate placement of objects in the water. "He prepared for us," Colt whispered, a sudden chill replacing the tropical heat in his stomach. "He's been setting traps, look." He pointed to a small, almost invisible snare wire fashioned from fibrous vine, stretched across the expected path of anyone attempting to follow the bank. Had a man or a dog stepped there, they would have tripped directly into a pit hidden beneath a thin layer of decaying leaves. The discovery served as a sharp, painful pattern interrupt to the hunter's hubris. This was not a desperate fugitive. This was an architect of conflict. This man, Cain, had used the hours since his escape to meticulously turn the Delta, his former prison, into a fortress designed for a single purpose: defense unto death. The 28 men, who had entered the Delta with the assurance of a swift victory, now realized they were deep inside the lair of a creature that knew every twist of the environment better than they knew their own homes. The hunt had inverted. They were no longer the predators. They were intruders, stepping into a meticulously crafted killing ground. Colt, refusing to acknowledge the creeping fear, immediately reorganized his men. He knew that the fugitive's intelligence was a greater threat than his physical strength. "We proceed cautiously. 2 scouts forward, spread wide. If he has weapons, they are few. If he has traps, they are local. We have 28 guns, gentlemen. He has but 1 soul." But the men were already unnerved. They had been seeking a runaway slave. They had found instead a phantom strategist whose chilling preparations spoke of an intent far grander than mere survival. They began to notice the strange, unnerving details. The broken branches pointing in confusing directions, the small pile of fresh black mud left on a stump that clearly marked a specific location, the absolute lack of any natural wildlife sound, suggesting that the fugitive had established a profound, unsettling dominance over the natural world around him. The Delta man was not just running, he was waiting. He was establishing a periphery of terror. The first tangible consequence of this realization came late in the afternoon, as the low sun cast long, distorting shadows through the swamp. One of the forward scouts, a young man named Hollis, who had been boasting earlier about the easy money, suddenly let out a strangled, sickening gurgle. Hollis did not scream. He did not cry out a warning. He simply choked, a horrible wet sound that cut through the silence like a dropped blade. When the main party rushed forward, they found him collapsed, face down in the murky water. Colt pulled him out immediately, his uniform already stained with the blood that poured sluggishly from his neck. Hollis had been struck, not by a bullet, but by a heavy, sharpened stake that had been concealed vertically in the water and covered with moss, rigged perhaps to a tripwire or simply placed to pierce the chest or throat of a carelessly advancing man. It was medieval in its simplicity and horrifying in its effectiveness. The wound was deep, crude, and instantly fatal. The stake was carved from cypress wood, hardened by fire, and smeared not just with mud, but with something else, something dark and foul, a mixture that promised a slow, agonizing corruption, even if the victim had somehow survived the initial impact. 27 men now stood huddled together, the fear of the invisible enemy warring with their deeply ingrained sense of superiority. They had lost a man not to a fight, but to the landscape itself, weaponized by the fugitive. They realized that their numbers, which had seemed such an overwhelming advantage, now merely represented more targets for an enemy who possessed the ultimate tactical advantage: perfect concealment and intimate knowledge of the battlefield. They were now locked in a death struggle with a man who had transformed himself from property into a force of nature, a terrifying embodiment of the Delta's brutal indifference. The hunt for the runaway slave Cain had officially begun, but what they were now facing was Il Mostro del Delta, the monster of the Delta, and he had just drawn the first blood, proving that 28 men were merely an inventory to be reduced. The sun began its final descent, sinking below the horizon and plunging the swamps into a darkness thick enough to chew. The hunter's hubris was gone, replaced by a cold, desperate need for vengeance and survival. Their task was no longer capture, it was war, and the war had begun with the brutal, silent annihilation of the first of the 28. The monster was real, and he was home. What followed next was not a chase, but a systematic reduction, a terrifying tally marked by screams lost to the night, and the sickening realization that Cain was not just fighting for his freedom, but for the complete erasure of his pursuers. Join us in part 2, where we will detail the gruesome tactics of the Delta Man and the catastrophic events of the first bloody night, revealing exactly how a single desperate fugitive managed to turn 27 professional hunters into victims of their own arrogance and the unforgiving swamp. The air itself was a heavy, suffocating shroud, laced with the metallic tang of stagnating water and the sickly sweet scent of rotting vegetation. The Mississippi Delta, in that feverish summer of 1850, was not merely a landscape, it was a living, breathing, hostile organism, demanding tribute from any who dared trespass beyond the manicured rows of king cotton. The 28 men who formed the hunting party, the self-proclaimed vanguard of civilization and property, had entered this primeval cathedral with arrogance, their flintlock rifles glistening with unwarranted confidence. Now 3 days into the pursuit, that confidence had been slowly, agonizingly leached out of them by the oppressive humidity, the ceaseless drone of chinch bugs, and the absolute silence of the man they sought. The initial track was clear enough, following the edge of a scorched field and disappearing into the dense acreage known locally only as the Black Shallows. This area was infamous even among those born to the Delta soil, a place where the earth was unreliable, where waterways changed course with every heavy rain, and where the ancient, gnarled cypress trees stood like silent, monstrous sentinels, draped in funereal cloaks of Spanish moss. This moss, ubiquitous and spectral, hung down 20 feet in places, creating a perpetual dusty twilight even at noon. It absorbed sound and light, transforming the known world into a labyrinthine maze where direction ceased to hold meaning, and where every step was measured against the certainty of sinking boots and creeping paranoia. The hounds were the first to break. Expensive, highly trained curs, bred for the very purpose of retrieving runaway property, they had begun the pursuit with characteristic eagerness. But within hours of penetrating the deeper swamplands, their enthusiasm curdled into whimpering terror. They were not lost, they were paralyzed. They would sniff the ground, locate the trace scent of the fugitive, and then freeze, tails tucked tightly, letting out low, guttural moans that spoke less of frustration and more of profound, instinctual dread. They strained at their ropes, attempting to pull back toward the relative safety of the plantation boundaries, their eyes rolling wildly, seeing perhaps what the hunters could not. That the creature they tracked was no longer merely a man, but something fused with the swamp, a shadow possessing uncanny knowledge of its terrain. Master Harlan Prescott, the self-appointed captain of this punitive expedition, a man whose lineage traced back to the first English families who settled the Natchez Trace, felt the sickening lurch of anxiety in his gut. He had expected a swift rounding up, a few hours of exertion followed by the satisfying application of the lash, a gruesome public example to discourage future impudence. Instead, they were wading through thigh-deep stagnant pools, their fine leather boots ruined, the water teeming with mosquitoes so thick they sounded like an angry, unified entity. The heat was a tangible weight, clinging to the skin, pressing down on the lungs, inviting the spectral, invisible sickness that stalked every resident of the region. The malaria, the river fever. The first tangible sign of the fugitives' cunning came on the morning of the fourth day. The hunters, exhausted and short-tempered, reached a narrow, sluggish creek that necessitated the felling of a small log for passage. Before they could begin cutting, they found it, a roughly shaped raft, just wide enough for one man, fashioned crudely from bundled cane and secured to a low-hanging willow branch. It was a sign of meticulous, deliberate effort. "He used the water," muttered Jebediah Thorne, a hardened overseer known for his grim efficiency, running a calloused hand over the damp wood. "He crossed here, but he didn't just cross. He built something." Prescott scowled, wiping the sweat and mud from his spectacles. "A raft is hardly the work of a fiend, Thorne. He's trying to put distance between us. Cowardly, predictable. But the chilling detail was not the raft itself. It was the precision with which it had been concealed. It was tied just below the waterline, almost impossible to spot unless one knew precisely where to look, utilizing the natural refraction of the light through the murky water. Moreover, resting gently upon the raft, placed with strange care, was a single, intricately carved piece of black walnut. It was smooth, highly polished, bearing the unmistakable shape of a small human ear. It was not gore. It was craftsmanship. It was a deliberate, silent message. It spoke not of frantic flight, but of controlled, malicious engagement. The fugitive was not merely running, he was establishing a line of communication with his pursuers, informing them, without uttering a single sound, that he saw them, he knew their path, and he had time enough to whittle tokens for their distraction. The message was so profoundly unnerving that even the roughest men among the posse fell silent, their eyes darting through the spectral moss. The psychological warfare intensified after that discovery. The pattern of the chase shifted. Where before they had followed clear tracks, the displaced mud, the broken reeds, now they encountered elaborate, perplexing misdirection. A path of crushed ferns would lead suddenly to a wide, open clearing, only for the true direction to backtrack 20 yards into a thicket of saw palmetto, an almost impenetrable wall of spiky growth. The fugitive was testing their patience, forcing them to expend energy on futile searches, ensuring they remained perpetually exposed to the swamp's ravages. The men began to suffer acutely. The relentless, biting insects drove them to distraction. The moisture permeated everything. Their powder was damp, their biscuits moldy, their morale fragile. They spoke in hushed tones, The boastful stories of the plantation reduced to whispers of fever, ghosts, and the terrible power of the Delta's ancient spirits. They were accustomed to commanding fear, not experiencing it. They were the masters of the ordered, surveyed land. Here, under the canopy of the primeval woods, they were helpless children, stripped of the power granted by their social status, reliant only on brute force, which the environment had rendered useless. Prescott tried to maintain order, barking commands, threatening those who lagged behind with their own reckoning, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept returning, against his will, to the image of the carved ear. What manner of man, hunted and alone, possessed the calm and the cruel creativity to leave such a perfect, bizarre marker? The stories they heard about the fugitive, a slave named by the master's wife, a man known for his unnatural quietude and immense physical strength, began to take on mythological weight. He was no longer just a runaway property. He was becoming the embodiment of the Delta's savage, untamed soul. The fifth night brought a thunderous storm, a true deluge that turned the swamp into a swirling, churning mass of dark water. The posse huddled miserably beneath a hastily erected canvas lean-to, sharing meager rations and fighting the creeping cold that humidity brought. In the chaos of the storm, amidst the blinding flashes of lightning that illuminated the grotesque shapes of the cypress roots, the fugitive struck his first terrifying blow. Elias Vance, a young, overly eager hunter who had volunteered for the expedition mainly for the excitement, had been tasked with keeping watch near the temporary camp's perimeter. He was standing near a dense stand of black oak, his silhouette briefly visible with every flash of heavenly light. The sound was not a scream or a struggle. It was a wet, sickening snap, instantly followed by the heavy thud of a body falling into soft mud. The men lurched upright, clutching their muskets, peering into the chaos of the downpour. The storm swallowed all sound, yet the absence of Vance's voice was deafening. Prescott, adrenaline momentarily overriding his fear, grabbed a lantern and, shielding the weak flame, led a small group toward the last place Vance had been seen. What they found was not a fight, but an execution carried out with chilling efficiency and an intimate understanding of Newtonian physics. Vance was dead. He lay flat on his back, his face a mask of shock and terror, his chest utterly collapsed. Above him, spanning the gap between two massive oak trees, was a tripwire, a thin, almost invisible strand of tough river cane. This cane was attached to a complex mechanism of vines and pulley-like knots, anchored to a young, extremely flexible sapling that had been bent almost double and held in tension. Vance had stepped on the wire. The tension on the sapling was instantly released, propelling a massive, waterlogged segment of a fallen log, which had been positioned perhaps 10 feet up in the air, downward with the force of a wrecking ball. The weight, combined with the momentum provided by the coiled sapling, had hit him squarely in the chest, crushing bone and halting his breath before he could even register the threat. It was not a desperate trap. It was engineering. It was a calculated use of the Delta's resources, turning the very vegetation they sought shelter under into lethal weapons. The fugitive had observed their movements, anticipated their placement of the guard, and spent hours, perhaps the entire previous night, constructing this silent, devastating snare just yards from their sleeping forms, all while the storm brewed. This realization that the monster was not retreating, but weaving a deadly perimeter around them, sent a true paralyzing shockwave through the posse. They were not hunting. They were entering a carefully prepared, meticulously constructed killing field. The master of the Delta was systematically reducing their numbers, not through frontal assault, but through the patient application of indigenous knowledge and sheer, frightening malice. They retrieved Vance's body, the process agonizingly slow in the mud. There were 27 of them now, yet they felt fewer, diminished not only by the death but by the absolute, crushing revelation of the enemy's skill. Their muskets felt useless against a ghost who utilized the laws of nature as his allies. Prescott, trembling, ordered a retreat from that spot, moving the camp further inland to a small rise of ground that felt marginally drier. He gathered his men, trying to reassert his authority, his voice thin and strained as he spoke of righteous duty and the importance of property. But the men's eyes were fixed on the surrounding shadows, on the swaying moss that looked increasingly like the tattered banners of death. "He wants to wear us down," Prescott rasped, clutching his expensive shotgun as if it were a talisman against the encroaching darkness. "He is relying on us becoming exhausted, sick, and scared. We cannot give him the satisfaction. We press on at dawn. We will find his lair and we will burn him out." But the fugitive had anticipated this too. Before they could settle for the night, another discovery was made, a truly appalling act that shattered whatever remnants of morale they possessed. Half buried in the mud near the high ground where they intended to rest, protruding slightly like crude grave markers, were 27 small, hand-painted wooden stakes. Each stake bore a single distinct symbol etched into the wood with a sharp instrument. They were primitive, yet instantly recognizable. Each symbol was a crude, stylized caricature of one of the remaining 27 men. Prescott saw his own stake, a man with spectacles and a high collar, marked with a deep, vertical scratch across the throat. The markers were numbered in sequence, starting not from 1, but from 2. The first stake, the one representing Elias Vance, was gone. The fugitive had taken a census of his prey. He knew who was dead, and he knew precisely who remained. More terrifyingly, he had taken the time in the midst of their pursuit to designate the precise, methodical order in which the 27 of them were destined to die. The terror was no longer abstract. It had been assigned a number. They were not hunters. They were merely numbers on a list, waiting for the swamp to claim them according to the fugitive's terrible timetable. The men spent the rest of the night staring into the darkness, huddled around a miserable, sputtering fire. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of the leaves, every distant croak of a bullfrog sounded like the final approach of the executioner. They had pursued a man. They had found a force, and that force, silent and unseen, was already moving through the shadows, preparing the next, more complicated and infinitely more deadly trap for the next designated number on its grim tally. They were trapped in the heart of the Delta, 27 men surrounded by an environment that had turned against them, being stalked by a quarry whose cunning surpassed all their expectations, and whose patience was as vast and ancient as the swamp itself. The slow attrition had begun, and every man knew with dreadful certainty that their names were already scratched into the dark soil of the great Mississippi Delta. The discovery was not heralded by a gunshot or the baying of triumphant hounds, but by a chilling, profound silence that swallowed the buzzing of the insects and choked the humid air of the Delta. It was the silence of total cessation, an absolute void where 28 souls had recently thundered with purpose, arrogance, and the casual cruelty of men confident in their dominion. The men who finally stumbled upon the clearing, a secondary posse composed not of hunters, but of nervous plantation managers and hastily deputized field hands, felt the air drop several degrees as they approached the scene, an anomaly in the sweltering Mississippi afternoon of 1850. The clearing itself was less a battleground and more an abattoir, though one executed with a perverse surgical efficiency that spoke volumes about the solitary combatant. The bodies were sprawled across the thick, damp earth, arranged by the violence of their end, rather than by the hands of the perpetrator. It was the weapons that first captivated and then sickened the onlookers. Rifles lay broken, stocks shattered against trees, or bent into unnatural shapes, barrels twisted like discarded wire. Powder horns were split, their precious contents scattered and ruined by the pervasive damp. This was not merely self-defense, it was the annihilation of the means of resistance. The injuries sustained by the fallen were grotesque in their variety and terrifying in their power. Some men had been crushed, their chests stove in as if impacted by a falling cypress log. Others bore deep, clean lacerations, wounds that suggested a blade handled with expert, almost ritualistic precision, slicing through tendons and muscle with inhuman force. But the true horror lay in the details reserved for the most senior members of the initial hunting party, the renowned trackers and the overseer known for his particular savagery. These individuals had been dispatched with a specific, personalized brutality that transcended mere killing. Their faces, frozen in rictus masks of final, desperate fear, were turned toward the thick woods, eyes wide as saucers, reflecting not the sky, but the green, impenetrable wall from which the attack had sprung. 28 men. The number resonated through the delta like a death toll struck upon a colossal bell. It was not just the loss of life, grievous as that was to the families who now faced ruin and widowhood, but the profound psychological and economic damage inflicted upon the entrenched structure of the region. This was a direct, devastating blow to the concept of property, to the notion of white supremacy, and most critically, to the illusion of invulnerability that the plantation owners cherished. 28 rifles, 28 sets of expertise, 28 bodies of armed authority, all reduced to bloodied meat by a single determined slave. The governor himself, sitting in Jackson, received the dispatch with a mixture of disbelief and visceral panic. This was not an insurrection. Those were contained, messy, and typically involved groups acting rashly. This was something colder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. This was a judgment delivered by a solitary, calculating force. Orders were immediately issued. The entire area surrounding the massacre, a swath of land covering nearly 100 square miles of swamp, canebrake, and dense forest, was to be placed under effective martial law. Bounties were quadrupled, not just for the runaway's capture, but for any actionable intelligence leading to his location. The official story, carefully crafted and whispered only in private circles, stressed that the hunters had succumbed to an ambush involving a small, organized gang of runaways, a desperate lie needed to avoid mass hysteria. The truth, known only to the investigators who walked the muddy perimeter of the clearing, was that there had been only one set of tracks, one discernible pattern of movement, and one monstrous force at work. The first organized, state-sanctioned hunting party arrived 3 days later, composed of veteran bounty hunters imported from Tennessee and Kentucky, men renowned for their cold efficiency and total lack of conscience. They brought with them specialized equipment, the finest Cuban bloodhounds, bred specifically for tracking human scent, heavy repeating rifles, and a grim determination fueled by the promise of wealth and the restored pride of the South. These hunters, unlike their predecessors, approached the Delta with appropriate reverence, recognizing it not as a backdrop for a simple manhunt, but as the monster's fortress. Yet, even their professional cynicism was swiftly eroded by the environment itself. The Mississippi Delta in high summer was a crucible of discomfort, a place where heat and humidity merged into a thick, suffocating blanket that muffled sound and strained the nerves. The air hung heavy with the smell of stagnant water, decaying vegetation, and the faint, pervasive metallic tang that the veteran trackers instantly recognized as the residue of deep, violent stress. The hunt quickly devolved into a frustrating, terrifying game of shadow and noise. The bloodhounds, creatures of exceptional tenacity, would pick up a trail, a strong, clear scent that led them deep into the heart of the cypress swamp. The hunters, sweating profusely under the weight of their gear, would follow, splashing through knee-deep water, battling the thick, thorny undergrowth, but the trail never concluded in a cornered man. It always ended abruptly, in the middle of a creek where the quarry had clearly walked underwater for yards before emerging on the far bank, or at the base of a massive ancient oak tree where the man had scaled the trunk and vanished into the canopy, utilizing the dense, intertwining branches as a personal highway above the boggy earth. The frustration was physical, burning in the lungs and aching in the muscles. But the terror was psychological. The monster of the Delta, as the locals had begun whispering in fearful reverence, was not simply running. He was watching. There were instances, subtle at first, that chipped away at the hunter's resolve. Small, deliberate markings left deep in the woods. A snapped branch pointed clearly back the way they had come. A tiny, expertly constructed snare trap, set not to catch game, but to catch their attention, strategically placed near where one of the hunters would stop to rest. These were not the desperate actions of a cornered animal. They were the calculated taunts of an intelligence vastly superior to their own. One afternoon, 3 weeks into the futile pursuit, the lead tracker, a hardened Georgian named Silas, found something truly unnerving. Deep within a maze of willow roots where the scent trail had predictably vanished, he discovered a small, meticulously carved wooden doll, a crudely rendered figure dressed in the tattered remains of a cotton shirt. It bore no obvious significance, but when Silas turned it over, he saw that the face had been etched with disturbing care. A wide, mocking smile, and eyes made from tiny, polished stones that seemed to catch the weak sunlight and stare back at him with an unsettling, knowing quality. The message was clear. "I see you. I know you are here." Silas, a man who had faced down escaped convicts and vengeful Seminoles, felt a cold dread worm its way into his stomach. He was hunting a man who did not merely seek survival, but who was engaged in a philosophical war against his pursuers, utilizing the very environment as his weapon and his shield. The open loops of the original investigation began to multiply, feeding the growing dread. How did he know the routes? How could a single man possess the strength to dispatch 28 well-armed individuals with such speed and silence? Rumors started circulating, whispered nervously in the kitchen halls of the big houses and shouted in panicked sermons in the slave quarters. Some said the man was not a man at all, but an ancient spirit of the swamp, embodying the accumulated misery of generations of enslaved people who had died beneath the Delta's cruel sun. They claimed he could dissolve into the black water, that he wore the Spanish moss as a shroud, and that he was guided by a hunger for vengeance that could never be sated. Others, more pragmatic but equally fearful, theorized that he possessed intimate, almost supernatural knowledge of herbal remedies and poisons, allowing him to disable his initial attackers before they could even raise their weapons. The hunt became less about capture and more about proving that the monster was indeed mortal. The psychological toll on the hunters intensified daily. The humidity caused fevers and hallucinations. The constant high-pitched whine of the mosquitoes was a relentless torment. Sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every call of a nightbird was interpreted as the prelude to a silent, crushing attack. Men began to argue, blaming each other for lost trails or misinterpreted signs. The disciplined structure of the hunting party started to fray at the edges, dissolving into paranoia and exhaustion. One night, the camp awoke to the sound of one of the younger hunters screaming hysterically. He claimed to have seen the monster standing at the edge of the firelight, impossibly tall, silent and motionless, staring directly into the camp before melting back into the darkness. While the other hunters dismissed the sighting as fever-induced madness, they noticed that the hunter's rifle, which had been leaning against a log near his bedroll, was gone. It was not taken violently, but cleanly, stealthily. A deliberate, unsettling theft that reinforced the intruder's proximity and audacity. The governor, facing political pressure and the rising anxiety among the plantation owners who feared a mass uprising spurred by the monster's legend, demanded results. The hunt was escalated to a semi-military operation. A detachment of state militia was deployed, bringing with them organized tactics, heavy rations, and most ominously, field artillery. A ridiculously disproportionate response to a single runaway, but one driven by overwhelming fear. The new strategy was based on sheer manpower and brute force, a massive sweep operation designed to systematically reduce the size of the territory until the monster was inevitably forced into a bottleneck. They began constructing a series of high, temporary fences made of sharpened stakes, effectively cutting off the western escape routes leading toward Texas and the Free Territories. This was the largest, most expensive manhunt in Mississippi history, transforming the beautiful, brooding delta into a war zone. The climax of this phase of the pursuit came in early autumn, when a breakthrough, or what they desperately believed was a breakthrough, occurred. After weeks of methodical sweeping, one of the detachments found a small, hidden lean-to, deep within a particularly inhospitable section of quicksand and dense vines. The structure was crude but effective, containing clear evidence of long-term habitation, dried smoked meat, a small handmade leather water pouch, and several sharpened sticks resembling primitive throwing spears. More importantly, they found the missing rifle. It lay discarded near the entrance, clean and functional, but its stock had been carved with new markings, an intricate pattern of twisting vines and abstract symbols that seemed to mock the civilized world from which the weapon had originated. The assumption was immediate and intoxicating. He had been utilizing the area as a temporary base, and they had forced him to abandon it. The bloodhounds were brought in, and this time the scent was explosive. The strong, clear track of a man fleeing rapidly, heading directly toward the river. The militia commander, Major Hawthorne, a man more comfortable on a parade ground than in a swamp, ordered a swift, decisive chase. They followed the trail for hours, the scent growing stronger, indicating the monster was close, exhausted, and finally, panicked. The trail led them to the bank of a tributary, wide and dark, flowing swiftly toward the main artery of the Mississippi. Hawthorne positioned his troops on either side of the riverbank, rifles ready, lights focused on the water. They had him cornered. The air crackled with tense anticipation, the hunters tasting victory after months of humiliation. Then they heard the sound. It was not the sound of splashing or frantic swimming. It was a rhythmic, unnervingly steady thump-thump-thump coming from the dense cover on the opposite bank. Hawthorne ordered silence. The sound continued, deliberate, measured, and slow. One of the more experienced trackers cautiously crept forward, peering through the undergrowth, his heart hammering against his ribs. He raised his lantern just slightly, illuminating a small, open patch of ground directly across the water. There was no man. There was only a crudely assembled drum, fashioned from a hollowed log and stretched hide, resting on a stump. And beneath it, propped carefully against the stump, were the 28 pocket watches taken from the bodies of the first hunting party. They had been laid out in a perfect circle, their glass faces reflecting the lantern light, all stopped precisely at the same time, the moment of the initial massacre. The thump-thump-thump was being caused by a long piece of twine attached to the drum and leading back into the deeper jungle, periodically pulled by some hidden mechanism, creating the slow, maddening heartbeat of the delta itself. The monster had not been fleeing. He had anticipated the sweep, rigged a decoy, and was now miles away, leaving behind a final, terrifying tableau that served not as a sign of his capture, but as a chilling reminder of his mastery over them, their time and their mortality. Major Hawthorne stood paralyzed, surrounded by 28 symbols of failure, the silence returning, heavy and absolute, save for the mocking, rhythmic beat of the unattended drum echoing into the suffocating night. The monster was still loose, still invisible, and still operating on a level of strategy that turned human hunters into mere pawns in his deadly game. The Delta held its breath, waiting for the true reckoning yet to come. The hunt had not ended. It had merely been reset, the quarry further cementing his legend as the ultimate specter of vengeance in the American South. The breath of the swamp was thick, heavier than linen soaked in molasses, pressing down upon the last surviving members of the hunting party. 3 men remained, ghosts of the proud force that had marched out 3 days prior, with 31 souls. They huddled together near a stagnant pool of water reflecting the sickly yellow moon, their faces smeared with the same dark mud that had claimed their comrades, and their eyes reflecting an exhaustion that went deeper than physical fatigue. It was the absolute exhaustion of the spirit, a realization that they were no longer the hunters, they were merely the final, desperate prey. Captain Beaufort, his jaw set hard beneath a layer of grime, gripped the muzzle-loaded rifle so tightly his knuckles were white, bloodless knots against the dark wood. He was a man carved from the rigid pride of the antebellum South, a man whose entire life had been predicated on the absolute, unquestionable order of things. The current chaos, this reversal of fate where a single despised chattel had systematically dismantled the established hierarchy of power, was not merely a failure of the hunt, it was a cosmic disruption, an insult that demanded total eradication. He refused to admit the terror that clawed at his throat, but the silence of the swamp screamed it for him. They knew, with a certainty that chilled them to the bone, that the monster was near. He was no longer running, no longer merely defending himself. He was executing. The development of the conflict had reached its horrifying apex. They had pursued him into this small, dense grove of cypress, a final, ill-advised push through the black water. The fugitive had led them here deliberately. It was not a hiding place. It was an arena, tailored precisely to his strengths and their crippling weaknesses. The ground was treacherous, littered with submerged roots and the skeletal remnants of previous floods. Every step was a risk, a potential plunge into the cold embrace of the bayou, and they moved with a debilitating caution. Their vigilance stretched thin by the weight of 28 recent violent deaths. The open loops of their terror began to tighten. Where had he learned such brutal precision? Was this truly the same docile, broken man they remembered from the fields? The transformation was complete. They were chasing not a man, but the manifestation of primal, unchecked vengeance, a force that had discarded all the civilized constraints they relied upon. Beaufort signaled to the 2 men flanking him. Davies, a nervous younger overseer whose hands shook so violently he could barely keep his powder dry, and Silas, a grizzled veteran who had seen battle in the Mexican War, but whose military training was useless against an enemy that moved like smoke and struck like a coiled cottonmouth. "He's ahead," Beaufort whispered, the sound immediately swallowed by the humid air. "We move slow. We keep the shot high, clear the head. No mistakes." They pressed forward, the dense canopy blocking the rising hint of dawn, keeping the world perpetually in a suffocating twilight. The air grew heavier, scented now not just with mud and decaying plant matter, but with something metallic and profoundly unsettling, the unmistakable tang of fresh blood. Davies gasped, a strangled sound that dissolved his last scrap of composure. He pointed a shaking finger toward a massive ancient cypress tree whose base flared out like the pedestal of a dark statue. Hanging impossibly high on one of the lower limbs, swaying gently in the unseen currents of the air, was the hunting bag of one of the men they had lost earlier that evening, perfectly intact. Beside it, placed with chilling deliberation, was a single, long-handled steel hoe, one of the tools of the field. This was the re-engagement, the final psychological twist of the knife. The enslaved man was mocking them, displaying the very implements of their perceived superiority, the rifle and the whip, against the raw, simple weapon he had used to carve his path to freedom. He was showing them that the strength lay not in the tools, but in the will. Then, the final, deafening silence fell. The usual cacophony of the swamp, the croaking frogs, the buzzing insects, the distant splash of an alligator, stopped entirely. Nature itself held its breath. The darkness resolved itself. The climax began not with a charge or a shout, But with the sudden, terrible realization of proximity, the fugitive was not in front of them, leading them deeper into the maze. He had doubled back, using the complex root systems and the murky water as his silent pathways. He was behind them, positioned between the three survivors and the only slightly clearer ground that offered an escape route. Silas, the old veteran, was the first to sense the shift in the air pressure, the subtle displacement of the dense humidity. He started to turn, his musket scraping against the tree bark. It was too late. The attack was a blur of efficiency, a violence that defied human speed. The fugitive, massive and sculpted by decades of backbreaking labor, moved with the precision of a striking predator. He had armed himself not just with crude weapons, but with the weight of his entire brutalized history. A thick cypress branch snapped clean from the tree and honed to a lethal point slammed down upon Silas's shoulder. The blow was so tremendous it did not merely break the bone, it drove the musket from his grasp and collapsed the man onto the muddy earth. Before Silas could even cry out, the fugitive descended. There was a wet, sickening crunch as the man's neck was snapped swiftly, definitively, the act delivered with the impersonal finality of an executioner. The old soldier was silenced, transformed instantly from a living menace into another piece of swamp detritus. Davies screamed, a high, piercing sound that cracked the silence and immediately signed his death warrant. He fumbled with the flintlock mechanism of his rifle, panic overriding training. The shot misfired, the powder sizzling uselessly in the damp pan. Beaufort roared, a sound of pure aristocratic rage mixed with mounting despair. He raised his rifle, sighting the enormous figure now turning towards Davies. The moment his finger tightened on the trigger, the fugitive acted. He did not run or duck, he used Davies as a shield. A piece of heavy chain, ripped from a nearby mooring post or perhaps carried from the plantation itself, a potent symbol of his bondage, swung out, connecting not with Davies, but with the rifle in Beaufort's hands. The force was stunning. The rifle was torn from the captain's grip, spinning away into the deep water with a heavy splash. Davies was now facing the monster alone, his face pale and slick with terror. The fugitive seized him by the throat. Davies clawed weakly at the massive arm, his legs kicking uselessly in the mud. The monster looked down at the overseer, and in that fleeting moment, Beaufort claimed later, there was not hatred in his eyes nor insanity. There was only a profound, devastating emptiness, the look of a man who had crossed a boundary from which there was no return, performing a necessary, tragic duty. The sound of Davies's life being extinguished was brief, choked, and terrible. He was thrown into the pool of stagnant water, disappearing beneath the surface, leaving only widening ripples that disturbed the moon's reflection. And then, only Captain Beaufort remained. The two men stood separated by perhaps 10 feet of water and roots. Beaufort was unarmed, his pristine boots now ruined, his expensive linen shirt torn and caked in the swamp's foulness. The fugitive, breathing heavily but steadily, stood taller than ever, illuminated by the gradual creeping light of the approaching dawn. He was stained head to toe in the dark mud, which served as camouflage, and slick with the blood of his victims. He was terrifyingly beautiful in his savagery. "You are a brute," Beaufort whispered, his voice failing him. He was trying to invoke the laws of civilization, the rules of the world that had shattered around him. "You are an animal. This will not stand." The fugitive did not reply with words. He replied with motion. He lifted the heavy steel hoe, its sharp, field-worn edge catching the sickly grey light. He approached Beaufort slowly, deliberately. This was not the chaotic frenzy of the previous skirmishes. This was the final, inevitable reckoning. Beaufort, driven by instinct and a desperate attempt to regain control, grabbed a heavy, waterlogged log, swinging it wildly. It connected harmlessly with the fugitive's shoulder. The final blow was delivered with the controlled power of a man who had wielded that precise tool for every waking hour of his miserable life. The hoe struck Beaufort across the chest, crushing his ribs inward with the force of a battering ram. Beaufort fell, gasping, the air driven violently from his lungs. He looked up at the figure towering over him, seeing in the dark, resolute eyes the answer to all his arrogant assumptions. The fugitive raised the hoe one last time. The sharp edge descended, not upon the captain's head, but upon his hands, the soft, unused hands of the planter, pinning them brutally to the muddy ground, a gesture of profound symbolic violence. The monster did not stop there. He leaned in, his face close to the captain's ear, close enough for Beaufort to smell the sweat, the swamp, and the sheer desperation clinging to him. What was whispered, Beaufort would never live to share. It was said to be a sound not of triumph, but of deep, ancient sorrow. A curse, perhaps, spoken in a low, resonant voice that belonged both to the man and to the mournful history of the Delta itself. Then, the final, merciful darkness descended upon Captain Beaufort. The last of the hunters was silenced. The open loops were closed with terrible finality. 32 armed men, planters, overseers, and hired guns, annihilated by a single, determined, enslaved man. When the sun finally broke through the canopy, painting the scene in shocking clarity, only the water moved. The fugitive was gone. He had vanished into the maze of the Delta, leaving behind a tapestry of absolute destruction. It was 2 days before a second, much larger search party, accompanied by militia units from Vicksburg, dared to enter the deepest stretch of the swamp. They found the grim evidence. They found the bodies, bloated and mutilated, scattered among the cypress roots, bearing testament to the unbelievable ferocity of the encounter. The confirmation was immediate and devastating to the pride of the ruling class. 32 men, all gone. The bodies of Davies and Silas were recovered quickly, and finally, the gruesome scene of Captain Beaufort's execution. The symbol of plantation authority, literally disarmed and grounded by the tools of servitude. The plantation owners understood the gravity of the situation instantly. This was not merely a runaway slave. This was an insurrection contained within one colossal human frame. If the truth were known that a single individual, armed only with fury and intelligence, could erase an entire posse of armed white men, it would ignite the entire Delta. Fear of slave revolts was the constant burning anxiety of the South, and this event threatened to be the match that lit the powder keg. A conspiracy of silence descended upon the Delta, cold and hard as the steel used to kill the captain. The official reports were immediately falsified. The narrative spun for the outside world was carefully curated. A fierce outbreak of swamp fever, perhaps, or a sudden attack by a band of desperate vagrants from the north, leading to the loss of only a handful of good men while tracking a violent criminal. The vast, undeniable body count was attributed to circumstances, and the bodies were buried quickly, silently, without the customary mourning and fanfare that the ruling class demanded. The name of the enslaved man, the singular architect of this massacre, was erased entirely from the official records, becoming a phantom. But the sheer scale of the bloodletting was too great to be entirely contained. The horror seeped into the ground, into the water, and into the hushed conversations held late at night behind locked doors. In the quarters among the enslaved population, the tale was transmitted with reverent fear and secret, profound pride. He became known not by his human name, but by the title the fearful masters had bestowed upon him, Il Mostro del Delta, the monster of the Delta. They spoke of him as a force of nature, a vengeful spirit conjured from the suffering of generations, a man who had finally said, "No more," and backed the refusal with the weight of 32 dead men. The fugitive's disappearance was total. He was never captured. No trace was ever found, not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint leading out of the swamp. He simply dissolved into the terrifying, boundless wilderness of the Mississippi Delta, becoming integrated into the very geography of resistance. The legacy of this event was dual. For the planters, it was a crippling wound to their sense of absolute superiority, a terrifying reminder that their world was built on a foundation of suppressed violence that could, at any moment, erupt. They became more fearful, more draconian, and ironically, more vulnerable. For the enslaved, the legend of the monster was a hidden fire, a quiet promise whispered under the moon. It was the absolute, irrefutable proof that freedom, however costly, however brutal, was always within the realm of possibility. His act was not just survival, it was annunciation. He had taken the violence meant for him and returned it multiplied tenfold, achieving a unique, terrifying form of freedom earned through total resistance. The monster of the Delta became the eternal shadow in the swamp, a silent sentinel who guarded the borders of fear and defiance. The sounds of the swamp at night, the snapping twig, the heavy splash, were no longer just the sounds of nature. They were the rustling cloak of the legend, the constant echo of the night when one man, armed only with fury and a field hoe, annihilated the very definition of his oppressors. The vast, humid darkness of Mississippi, 1850, swallowed the man, but it was unable to swallow the monstrous truth of what he had achieved. This enduring, horrifying tale confirms a stark historical reality. The greatest horrors often emerge not from myth or madness, but from the brutal, unyielding desperation born of human bondage. It is a story etched not in parchment, but in the deepest mud and darkest waters of the American South. If you wish to delve deeper into the hidden narratives that history tries to bury, those moments where the marginalized roar back with primal ferocity, let the quiet be broken. There are countless shadows still waiting to be brought into the terrifying light.